Hello, I'm Kettaneh, and I'm an artist. During confinement that was brought by the latest pandemic, we questioned the notion of home and the limits of our space. Home is not just the physical space we inhabit, it's the domain of our intimate being. It is where we dream and make memories. So when that space is questioned or attacked, we become anxious. We fidget and become restless, pacing the space back and forth, opening and closing windows and doors, until we realize that perhaps the only way out of that unrest is perhaps through forgetting language, the system or the beliefs that define and limit our notion of home. That way, we are open of resetting and finding new meanings of home, and hence our intimate being. So we're open to dreaming differently and remembering differently. So maybe we need to forget the word home, starting with the letter H. I'd like to start this presentation by sharing with you the artwork that I'm currently showing in a collective exhibition. It's a couple of animations that I built with code. The first animation is a result of tests that I ran on the letter H. I wanted to see how far I needed to change the basic units of that letter until we no longer recognized it as H. I'm just going to move forward. So it keeps looping back towards the set of H's and deformations happen, but the traces from the previous changes remain, just so that there's a kind of buildup. I'm going to move this a bit forward. And then I did a similar test on the letter Ba, which is the first letter of Bait, which is home in Arabic. I'll show you a bit of that as well. Reflecting on my work and the elasticity of the letter that is expressed led me to Barbara Brownie's recent studies on kinetic typography. She says that most research in temporal media talk about motion or displacement of whole letters or words along the screen, but they overlook the instances where temporal media has allowed for exploring the malleability of the individual letter. The type designer's role is to create and transform letter forms. In print, such workout remains hidden, and what we see or use is the end result. The temporal media has allowed for this workout to be visible. We can see letters on the screen being created, sculpted, and transformed. Brownie calls those changes local kineticism. What Brownie is mostly interested in is the extremes of local kineticism, called fluidity, where deformations affect the identity of the letter form, allowing for a transformation of nature and meaning. The verbal identity might transform into another verbal identity or into an entirely new pictorial or abstract identity. She calls the identities poles, and usually at every pole, we have a form that can be easily recognized as text or image. During the transformation, one identity is lost and strange hybrid non-semantic forms arise before the next pole is reached. However, the meaning of the artifact is not complete at any one pole and is not the sum of the two poles. The meaning is complex and can only unravel gradually across time from text to image, text to text, or pole to pole. So the asemicist during the transformation is significant because it resembles two things: a learning experience. The unidentifiable glyphs in the intermediate stages create discomfort because the spectator experiences a phase of unsettling illiteracy. So those glyphs provoke the spectator's anticipation for the emergence of more familiar signs. So in a way, the intermediate phase of transformation prepares the viewer to become a reader and vice versa. When the meaning emerges at the next pole, there's a moment of relief and satisfaction of newly acquired knowledge. So fluid typography is like learning. As Asemic signs become legible, new knowledge and understanding is granted to the reader, as if he or she has just learned to read. It also resembles a life experience. Most of our human experiences are analog, involving graded relationships on a continuum. So when we try to express it in words, we fall short because words do not operate in a continuum. By naming things, we reduce the continuous to the discrete, and we end up perceiving our experiences as binary. On the other hand, fluid artifacts and their transformations give as much importance to the poles as the variations happening in between them, allowing for a continuous experience. And a good example of that is Dan Weber's strings, one in particular called argument. It presents a single string which repeatedly reforms itself between two words, yes and no. The clear yes becomes uncertain before it becomes a clear no, and vice versa. Yes and no are binary opposites, but argument bounds them across time with the string and hence presents them on an analog continuum. These intermediate unidentifiable glyphs arose as a consequence of fluidity. However, signs which function in similar ways appear in static media and have been named by Tim Gaze and Jem Leftwich, two visual poets, as Asemic writing. They coined this name in the 1990s when there was a surge of Asemic works being shared over the internet. But Asemic writing actually started long before it was named as such, like in the poetry of Henri Michaud, writings of Roland Barthes, and paintings of Cy Twombly. At its simplest, Asemic writing is, according to Tim Gaze, anything which looks like writing through their shape or organization, but in which the person viewing can't read any words. It's a kind of writing without language, writing without verbal signification. Leftwich explained in a letter to Gaze, a theme is a unit of meaning, or the smallest unit of meaning. An Asemic text then might be involved with units of language for reasons other than that of producing meaning. In his explorations of Asemicism, Gaze identifies a continuum that exists between text and image. Gaze argues that at one end of the continuum lies legible writing, then we have Asemic writing, then abstract images, and finally recognizable images. This spectrum resembles the continuum that fluid artifacts perform. However, in fluid artifacts, asemicism is temporary, and hence the uncomfortable phase of illegibility is temporary. But in Asemic writing, in static media, the illegibility is given fixed and does not promise a solution. So if Asemic writing leaves us frustrated, then why does it still appeal to us? And why do we still produce it? In the rest of the presentation, I'll try to explore the significance of Asemic writing and what it can convey, if not verbal meaning. Although there's a lot of Asemic works being produced and circulated, an increasing interest in it, yet there's not much written about it. My main reference was Peter Schrenger's book, Asemic, The Art of Writing, published in 2019. It can be considered as the first map and critical study of this fascinating field. Schrenger discusses the works of three Asemic ancestors. The first one is Henri Michaud. Henri Michaud is known for both his literary works and artworks. He aimed in both fields to push beyond conventions towards what he called the space within or beyond. He felt that words were limiting because they're kind of images, but restrictive ones. So he desired to build sentences without words, sentences that escape translation. This led him to an Asemic practice that focused on movement. He wanted continuity and change, devoid of the stop signs of words. He was very much influenced by dance and the language of the body. On the right is a work by Henri Michaud. It's from his book Mouvement. It's a book of markings that are created by improvised impulses, movements of the hand and accidents of ink. He called his Asemic forms not as shapes, but as interior gestures. These gestures did not convey letter, thoughts, or stable signs, but rather reflect an interior tempo. This interior tempo is emotion, which is part of our response to sensation or perception. Our emotions accompany our first vague forms of our ideas. So his gestures reflect not thought, but what precedes thought, an expression of our primal desire. Another Asemic ancestor, Roland Barthes, he was influenced by Henri Michaud and many others when he also tried to avoid meaning in order to unlock the power of the Asemic. What you see here is a selection from Barthes' Contre-Écriture. It was published in 1976 in a journal alongside the works of other artists that are now recognized as significant figures in the development of Asemic writing. His author's note read, "If my graphisms are illegible, it is precisely in order to say no to commentary. This is not a reflection of insecurity about his work, but rather a hint about commentary's fundamental nature. For commentary endlessly extends language. It's in the service of an impossible quest to extract the final drop of meaning." Barthes had an almost obsessive relation to writing instruments. For Barthes, writing was a sensual act. He was very much interested about the muscular act of tracing letters, its physicality, its scription, and the resulting materiality of accidental ink blots, gesture painting, or unconscious doodling. He chose to experiment with Asemic writing as an anti-mythological action. He wanted to overturn the old myth that assumed thought preceded language, and that language was only an instrument to transmit those thoughts, ideas, or information. He was in line with Saussur's proposition that without language, thought is a vague, uncharted nebula. There are no pre-existing ideas, and nothing is distinct before the appearance of language. Hence, the sign or writing is the condition of thought, not its instrument, medium, or expression. All the materials and material act of writing that he was interested in, the hand, the pen, the paper, were overlooked because we are conditioned to prioritize meaning in our reading. So to make writing visible in its truth, Barthes suggested that writing needed to be illegible. This is the only way that the graphic element will reclaim its primacy. He called his Asemic writing graphism in order to bridge the gap between writing and painting, which he believed were not fundamentally different. A third Asemic ancestor is Cy Twombly, which is the renowned painter, and he has this to say about the nature of line. The line is the feeling from a soft thing, a dreamy thing, to something hard, something arid, something lonely, something ending, something beginning. It's like I'm experiencing something frightening. I'm experiencing the thing and I have to be at that state because I'm also going. We can see those lines of feelings at work in his letter of resignation, which is a series of 38 drawings. This series might have been a response to the hostile reviews his works received a year earlier. Those reviews had affected him so much that he took a break from painting for almost a year. This break might be seen as the resignation expressed in the work. Yet that resignation from art is only a temporary one, because just by performing the letter of resignation, he's also returning boldly back to art. The emotions he felt must have been of frustration and anger, emotions that were beyond words. So his letters were written with agitation, without control, without articulation, without words. Through the violent and agitated markings, we can feel the physical venting of the pencil on the page. The writings devoid of verbal meaning return to their primal form as drawing. Only the forward intensity, the leaning, the cursivity of writing remained. The fact that he wrote multiple drafts reinforces the idea that the words come after the feeling. In each attempt, the writer tries to fit words ever more closely to the shape and quality of the feeling. Asemic writing is not only produced by artists, it is also produced by nature. According to Gaze, you could say that nature, since time began, has been manifesting Asemic writing. It just needs a human to see the writing and recognize it. De Villers-Sloan named those Asemic markings in nature as eco-Asemics. Some artists hunt for those markings and present them in their work. Sometimes the artist's intervention is minimal, like taking a photograph of nature as is, but in a specific frame or light or alignment. Other interventions undergo more process, like removing elements from nature and decontextualizing them or tracing over them. Sometimes the traces or markings are taken only as inspiration in making other works. If Asemic writing is frustrating because it carries no meaning, eco-Asemics is frustrating even more because of the absence of a human author. Without a human author, decoding those signs to satisfy our compulsion for finding a verbal meaning or intention becomes impossible. But just like Asemic writing carries the invitation to encounter the physicality of mark making and reading our primal gestures cleared from human language's dictation, eco-Asemic writing might be an invitation to consider a language that transcends the human. By offering markings akin to human writing, natural objects might be demanding that we pay attention to them. It might be an invitation to returning to language's origins from which we simulated our own and turned it into a human artifice. In the last section of my presentation, I'd like to discuss a short story by Jorge Luis Borges called Tlon Ukbar Orbis Tertius. The story is as difficult as its title sounds. It requires several frustrating readings before you start making a little sense of things. The story is about an encyclopedia that was written by a secret sect for an imaginary world called Tlon. Tlon is first introduced, however, as a mythical region in a non-existent land called Ukbar. The narrative of the story is a structure en abîme, starting from a reality that matches Encyclopedia Britannica. Reality starts gradually changing as we discover new versions of the encyclopedia, each version having a bigger fictional component. Orbis Tertius is the Encyclopedia of Tlon, written in the Tlonian language with its own special alphabet. Tlonians are idealists that don't believe in the continuity of objects, so their language has no nouns. They have two dialects, one that is based solely on adjectives and one that is based on verbs. Reality is finally threatened to become Tlon if Orbis Tertius is discovered, because that's when the Tlonian language would be adopted and all current languages would be forgotten. If you read the story carefully, you realize that Borges prepared his readers for this mise en abîme when he mentions at the very start, I owe the discovery of Ukbar to the conjunction of a mirror and an encyclopedia. So if we think of the encyclopedia as a conceptual verbal mirror of the world, then two mirrors placed in front of each other would lead to a mise en abîme. I find this setup insightful. I think this mise en abîme resembles Tim Gaze's spectrum between image and legible writing. So perhaps asemisis is a state in a mise en abîme between word and image. It makes sense then that asemisis is confusing and frustrating. Another point from this story, which I find significant to the discourse of this paper, is the statement that Borges makes towards the end of the story. How could one do other than to submit to Tlon, to the minute and vast evidence of an orderly planet? It is useless to answer that reality is also orderly. Perhaps it is, but in accordance with divine laws. I translate inhuman laws, which we never quite grasp. Tlon is surely a labyrinth, but it is a labyrinth devised by men, a labyrinth destined to be deciphered by men. So we have built our languages akin to the original inhuman languages of the world and assigned meaning to them. Humans readily adopted them because they were decipherable. So perhaps Eco-Asemic works remind us of the origins of language, and Asemic writings remind us of our compulsion to assign human meaning. I might be running out of time, so I'm gonna just simply jump to my final slides and wish you a happy summer. I don't know who the author is of this joke, but I really liked it, and I translate. I went to the doctor, and I think he prescribed for me a holiday by the sea. So with that, I wish you a lovely summer with hopefully some time by the sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Any questions? Any questions online?
It's Mark Huster. Thanks for this overview. It's really fascinating to view the various types of art. To what degree, that's my first question, would you see Asemic writing as a conscious contradiction in terms? And the second, or is it? Maybe it's not. And the second one is more for curiosity. Barth famously wrote his orthography in alphabetic sequence. Is there any relation specifically to his contre-écriture that you have been citing?
Sorry, could the two questions be repeated? The questions.
Okay. The first one is, to what degree do you consider Asemic writing a conscious contradiction in terms, or is it a contradiction in terms?
A contradiction in?
In terms, like a self-contradiction. And the second one is if there is any relationship between Barth's contre-écriture and his autobiography.
For the first question, you mean the word itself, Asemic and writing? And is there a contradiction in within the name?
Indeed. So since writing is supposed to encode something.
Yeah, the voice is too low, but if that's the question, then I would say, yes, there is a kind of a contradiction, which is, I mean, writing by itself means there is meaning. And then when you're saying Asemic, then it doesn't have meaning. So perhaps maybe it's not very accurate as a definition. It's like self-defeating, you know, it's Asemic, but it's writing. But I think it's just saying what it is. It's like we want it to be, it feels like it's writing, but it doesn't have a meaning. So visually it looks like writing, and it has the some aspects of writing, the physical aspects of it, but it doesn't have the content. But yeah, I don't find it problematic, because by itself it calls those things into question. What is writing, and what is it without meaning? As for the second question, I'm not too sure about the relationship between Barth's autobiography and Asemicis, but I'll definitely look it up.
I will continue. So you said Asemic writing has the physical aspects of writing, but in that case of what writing? Is there a specific writing system? So do you think that Barth has the aspects of the Latin alphabet writing, or is it really independent of his origin and his culture?
Yeah, it's, I think anything that for us looks like writing, and there's a huge variety of Asemic writing, and it can be digital, it can be something that in nature we find, which we haven't actually marked ourselves. So it's the physicality of it varies a lot. So it doesn't necessarily have to be handwritten. It can be also a product of our digital media. But it's anything that we recognize or we feel that calls us to read, but then when we come to read it, we're unable to.
And I have a question by Richard.
Yeah, I'm just curious, sort of in general, why pick writing as the model for this kind of art? I mean, there's lots of, humans have used all kinds of symbols that don't necessarily relate directly to language, to communicate information, but writing seems to be special. Is it that writing is particularly prestigious? Is it because it's particularly tied to language? Why pick that as the thing to model in this whole genre?
I think it has to do, it's a question more related to art in itself, because artists like to respond to their environment, and sometimes things that go unnoticed, if you decontextualize it, or you make changes to it, or you make some intervention in it, then it brings forward things that we haven't actually thought about. And yeah, it's decontextualizing, it's defamiliarizing, so that we actually come and think. And what more than writing, because writing defines our language, it defines our life. We're limited within this language that we've created.
Thank you.
Okay.
So it's a very rich domain to explore.
Surely is. Thank you very much, Christine. Through this image, we see also the landscape, and we hear the sounds of Lebanon, which is very beautiful. Thank you. So let us
Okay, thank you.
to the next speaker.